Well, good morning. This is the third week of our sermon series, The Story. And in this sermon series, we've been walking together as a church through the story of God, through the Bible. We've been using the avenue of the book called The Story, in which they've taken the stories of the Bible and they put them in chronological order, and they read more like a novel, so it's easier to understand, and they've put some context definitions in there as well to help us kind of figure out what's going on. Why are they doing this? And who are these people? And things like that. And so if this sermon series, and we're in the third week now, it's whet your appetite if you want to dive deeper into the Bible. We're, as Jill said, we're going to start a small group on Wednesday at 7 o'clock. And we'll have a chance to focus more on these stories. It's more discussion, so it's not just talking head up and talking to you about it. You can discuss, you can ask questions. Hopefully we'll have the answers for you. But it's going to be a lot of fun, so I encourage you to do that. There's a sign-up sheet on the bulletin board in the back. So a little recap of kind of the story thus far. In the first week we started in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. And He also created us. He created Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve, He was in community with Adam and Eve in the garden. And God was walking with His creation. And unfortunately, Adam and Eve chose to inject sin into our lives. And so sin became part of us. And so in doing so, we were separated from God. And we learned that from the very beginning, that ever since that happened, that God has been trying to get us back, trying to reconnect us to God. And so He does that first by a flood, and that doesn't work all that well. And then He decides to do it by starting a nation, by building a nation that will bless all other nations. And last week we learned about Abraham and Sarah and how He raised them up to have faith and to build this nation. Well, as we learned last week, they had a child. It was like 90. Sarah was 90, I think, when she had Isaac. So Virginia's 95. You can imagine Virginia having a child 5 years ago. Quite the adventure, I imagine. And so they had a child named Isaac. And Isaac had two children, Jacob and Esau. Esau was the firstborn, and so he was supposed to be the person that the blessings would go through, but he was tricked by Jacob. And so Jacob got the blessings, and so his lineage his family tree would start this nation. And Jacob had 12 sons. And one of those sons is Joseph. And Joseph is the story we're talking about today. One of my favorite stories in the Bible. Because Joseph is an amazing, amazing person. Let me get into that. So for my undergrad, I was, my bachelor's degree, I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, believe it or not. And so before I went to seminary, I attended lots of psychology classes and counseling and things like that. And I remember, of course, we could learn, these famous psychologists before it, and Young, and there's one by the name of Erik Erikson. And Erik Erikson's kind of claim to fame was he created these stages or phases of life. So each person kind of goes through these different phases of life. And so he kind of created these different phases. And one of the last phases that he created was this phase called integrity versus despair. So usually later in our lives, we get to the point where we get to a point in our lives where we look back on our life. And we see either integrity, or integrity means togetherness or completeness, if you will, or we see despair, we see brokenness. People nearing midlife often crash into something startling and unexpected. For instance, they dreamed big dreams when they were young. They had things they wanted to do, right? Dreams that they wanted to complete. And so through their lives, they they kind of just break that pace through their 20s, 30s, and 40s until they finally hit a wall. They stand with this realization that it's not going to happen for them. Their dreams or the things they wanted to do might not happen. And so sometimes they go into this thing called a midlife crisis. You might have seen this before, maybe a fancy car or a motorcycle is purchased. I don't know. Some don't make it that far with their aspirations, having already given them, they have already given up on along the way. Sometimes, usually, this is the blessings of children, kind of throw a wrench into their plans. But still, others make a bold decision to trade one dream in for another. To trade one dream in for another. And that's what Joseph did. Talk about dreams. He had big dreams. He dreamed that all of his brothers and his parents would bow down to him. And it's not that he dreamed that, but he decided to share that with all of his brothers. Right? You can imagine, they're all older brothers. And I don't know if you had siblings, but sometimes older brothers are not the super nicest. And then you tell them that they're going to bow down to you, probably not the greatest. And maybe even worse, Joseph was his father's favorite because he had Joseph so late in his years. And so he gave him this multicolored coat, which you're like, okay, pretty cool, I guess. The modern day equivalent would be like if you had 4 teenagers, imagine. You gave one of them an iPhone, and the rest of them you gave them a stack of quarters and told them to use a payphone. Right? So they were very jealous of their brother. And so they band together and they throw their brother into a ditch. And they eventually sell him into slavery at their first opportunity. And like I said in the children's story, they tell Jacob, the dad, that Joseph was killed by this ferocious animal. And so the next thing we know, we find Joseph in Egypt. And from there, Joseph's ride kind of goes on a roller coaster. Joseph is sold to this Egyptian administrator by the name of Potiphar. And Potiphar is so impressed with Joseph that he puts Joseph in charge of his whole house. But Potiphar's wife had other plans. She tries to seduce Joseph. And when he denies her, she falsely accuses him of assaulting her. So then Joseph is thrown into prison. He's a prisoner. And they find that Joseph is this great leader, and so they make him in charge of the prison. And while in prison, he meets the Pharaoh, which is pretty rare for a prisoner to meet the Pharaoh. But what happened was, while in prison, Joseph kind of gains this reputation that he's able to interpret dreams, which in Egypt in that time was there's a big thing on interpreting dreams. There was this importance that you could look into the future if you could interpret these dreams. And so the Pharaoh comes to Joseph because none of his wise men or magicians are able to kind of interpret these dreams that he's having. And so with God's help, Joseph is able to discern what these dreams mean. And essentially what these dreams mean is that in Egypt, there will be 7 years of abundant crops, of bumper crops, if you will. Well, they have more than enough. But then there's going to be 7 years of famine. We're not even, there'll be no harvest, and the plows will not touch the fields because the famine will be so great. And so Joseph says, what this dream is telling you is they need to store up for 7 years in order to provide for the next 7 years. And Pharaoh is so impressed with Joseph and recognizes that he has great wisdom. And he puts Joseph, not an Egyptian, but a Jew, in second in command of all of Egypt. So from slave to prisoner to now the second in command of all of Egypt. And so the 7 years have passed, and it was true, there was this abundance. But then the famine hit. And 2 years within the famine comes Joseph's brothers. You see, they were now to the point where they were hungry. And they come to Joseph, not knowing he's Joseph, they come to Egypt looking for food. And they bowed down to Joseph, now age 39, and asked him for food. Now these are the same brothers who beat Joseph and threw him into, sold him into slavery. Yes, Joseph was not angry. He had a right to be angry. I mean, he sold him into slavery. Yet Joseph is not angry. He's able to forgive his brothers because he saw something. He saw that God was up to something. He had captured the upper story of God, that God had a bigger plan. You see, in this whole view of the story, we know that God has this upper story, and then we have this lower story. And Joseph is seeing that what this upper story is, what it's all about. He's making sense of it, that God has a bigger plan. And what his brothers did was wrong, sure. But God used their sins and their jealousies to accomplish his overall purpose, his upper story. The famine would, of course, at this time, this nation of Israel is pretty small, right? It's essentially this family. It's Jacob's family, and of course you have Grandpa Isaac and great-grandpa Abraham. But it's just a very small family. And so this famine would have killed this nation of Israel. But supernaturally, God made a provision for their salvation by putting Joseph in the right place at the right time. Joseph's story interacted with God's story, where God is working for his purpose within the ups and downs of Joseph's story. Jill read for us Genesis 45, 3 through 8. I'm going to read it again. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve our remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it's not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." God was at work, revealing himself to this new nation. God made provisions for Joseph to sustain this new nation during the severe famine. Genesis 15, 19 to 20. But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended for it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today." Joseph was this agent to bring this new nation, this young nation that would bless the other nations, into Egypt. It was important that they go to Egypt. You could say, well, couldn't God just not have the famine? Well, the intended purpose was for this young nation to go to Egypt. For it wasn't time for this nation of Israel to take ownership of the land of Canaan. And they needed to be prevented from intermarrying between the Canaanites. And so the move to Egypt got them away from that intermarrying with the Canaanites. You see, Egyptians, that it was an abomination to marry shepherds, which was essentially what the Israelites were at that time, a family of shepherds. So in Egypt, and because Joseph was in place to provide for this family, they were given this very fertile land, the land of Goshen, where they thrived. Within Egypt, the Israelites grew to a great nation of over 1 million people. Joseph, though he had 20 years of hard life, was blessed for 71 more years. Now, Joseph could have lost his life by getting caught up in the details of his life, chasing his dreams, his own dreams, and his own desires. But instead, he chose a better story. He chose God's story. And we can do the same. If your life's dream has stalled you, look to God. If you hit that road or that realization that your dreams are not going to come true and they're not going to happen, look to God. Maybe you are living your dream, but it's not what you thought it was going to be. God can give you another dream, just like Joseph. You see, God is at work in the midst of the details of our very lives, accomplishing his good purpose. In Romans 8:28 was read, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. I'm going to read it again. We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Knowing that God's storyline is unfolding even in the bleak and confusing times allows us to live freely, to be able to forgive those who sin against us. God tests us in order to build our faith in God and character in us. Amen.